Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is Richard Lipman, your host. Today we are interviewing Gered Mankowitz. This podcast is kindly supported by Camera Museum of London, pre-owned Hasselblad specialists located at 44 Museum Street, London, WC1A 1LY. Visit the website on www.cameramuseum.uk. Gered, how are you?
I'm okay.
Right, yeah. Childhood connection to photography. Do you remember a story? Can you recall?
Yeah, so my father was quite a celebrity in the 50s and the early 60s. And we had quite a lot of photographers visit the home to shoot picture stories about him and the family. And one of these people who visited us quite often was a photographer called Tom Blau. And he owned a picture agency called Camera Press. And Tom was going to figure in my becoming a photographer in a big way down the line a bit. But my primary interest in photography was that I just enjoyed that whole experience. I liked seeing the equipment, I liked the lighting, I liked the mechanics of it, I think. I don't recall whether I had any feelings about having my photograph taken, particularly, but I enjoyed the mechanics of it. I enjoyed that. And then when I was about 12, I guess, my father was working with the actor-comedian Peter Sellers, who was an enormously enthusiastic amateur photographer, and he came to our house for Sunday lunch, and he came bringing a complete Hasselblad 500C kit, as well as a big Polaroid. I think it was the 405, which was pretty new and exciting, cutting edge stuff. And he started taking some extraordinary pictures of my brothers and I, including one where he managed to create the illusion that one of my brothers was sitting in the palm of my hand like Tom Thumb. And I was so enthralled and amazed by this and the way he did it, which was so simple, and the instantaneous effect of the Polaroid, that I thought, wow, this is really exciting. And then he showed me around the Hasselblad 500C, the ins and outs of it, showing me how it worked. But he did the whole thing in a sort of mad goon show, Swedish chef type voice, which had me in tears of laughter. And I just sort of associated this sort of happy, laughing state with the Hasselblad and with photography. And that was the point that probably changed my life.
Okay, so you were connecting images and photography with emotions. Is that correct? How important is it to feel in your line of work?
Well, if you didn't feel, if you didn't have empathy with your subjects, if you didn't have a sensitivity towards your subjects and an understanding of what it was that you and they were trying to project, then you couldn't really be a portrait photographer of the type that I was destined to become.
Do you remember the first thing you said to Tom Blau, or the first thing he said to you?
He very generously, I don't recall talking to him particularly when he visited us. I think he was probably very nice, quite sort of strict, quite European in his mannerisms, probably not over friendly, but I think he would have encouraged respect, and I think he probably had an air of confidence and importance about him. He was always somebody who appeared to know exactly what he was doing and what he wanted. So I expect that all came across to me, but I don't have a recollection of a conversation as such.
You then went to do an apprenticeship for 6 months at the at Tom Blau's studio. What did you learn?
Well, I learned the basics. I learned the sort of the foundations, I think, in various different areas. I mean, Camera Press was a very active commercial press agency, and I went through all the departments. I started off in the darkroom mixing chemicals. I then assisted a printer. I processed film. I went into the studio to assist Tom in the studio, and then he gave me lent me a Rolleiflex and sent me out to London Zoo to do a portrait of Guy the gorilla at the zoo. And I went with their motorcycle messenger to London Airport to collect film that was being sent back from a royal tour in Africa. I mean, I went through the sort of gamut of the process that goes into making a photo agency work. And I came out with a sort of foundation. But I think probably the single most important thing that he gave me and Camera Press gave me was access to hundreds and hundreds of wonderful portraits. Because of course, in those analog days, everything was printed, everything was stored in big manila boxes. And I had access to some of the finest portraiture of the 50s and early 60s. And, you know, I was able to sit down and really open these boxes and study these pictures, whether it was Arnold Newman or Karsh of Ottawa or God knows, I don't know, pictures of Jane Mansfield and Marilyn Monroe. It was a fantastic way of learning, seeing and looking and beginning to accumulate an understanding of what makes a really strong photograph.
Is there one picture that stuck in your mind?
Not really. No, not really. I think that the early pictures that influenced me are probably might have come from that period, or they might have just come from being aware of photography in the early part of my career. But I mean, Karsh of Ottawa, I liked his formality, and I thought that I liked the quality, although I thought it was odd the way he managed to make very disparate people look similar. But I like the formality of his portraits. They reminded me of sort of Holbein paintings. And Arnold Newman I like very much, but there were lots of others. I don't recall a single image that really changed anything.
We're going to jump forward over 50 years. Today, do people appreciate analog, or is it digital now?
Well, I mean, from a commercial point of view, I suppose it's digital. It's all digital. But I mean, increasingly, photographers are going back to film. There's a lot of photographers commercially are shooting several different formats during a session. So they might shoot digital, they might shoot a bit of film, they might even shoot Polaroid. They're using different mediums to affect a different feel. And I'm sure there are a lot of photographers shooting film. Certainly that's what people tell me. I don't shoot commercially, and when I do shoot, I shoot digital, and I have done for a while.
And in terms of getting work, is it the same as before? Do you need an agent? Or is everything through word of mouth?
Well, I don't get work, and I don't have an agent. But I mean, when I was working in advertising, it's imperative that you have an agent. And it was becoming like that in music. When I started, I didn't have an agent. It was all word of mouth, and it was all, there was a great deal of loyalty amongst clients. They tended to, if they liked you and they liked what you were doing, they tended to stick with you. As I say, I don't shoot commercially anymore, and haven't done for a long time. All my energy over the last 15 years or so has gone into my archive.
And in terms of, over the years, has your photography been lucrative enough for you to be able to sustain a living?
Gosh, I've earned a living from photography for over 60 years.
Right.
I mean, I haven't done anything else to earn a living.
We're going to go back now to the early 60s. And I'm looking at one of your books here. And in it are photographs of the Rolling Stones on stage in America in 1965. And you wrote here, it was virtually impossible to get good live group shots. So I concentrated on doing lots of individual portraits. I chose not to use flash and tried to capture as much of the natural excitement as possible. And this is from the book Satisfaction.
Yeah. I can't see it because you've got your filter.
Oh, right. Yes. I'm going to switch that off.
Don't worry. I know the book. Yeah. So what's your question?
My question is, how were you able to capture and record the light in such situations? Were you using an ISO 1600 film? What was your exposure stop technically? How did you capture that emotion? Were you taking many shots at the same time, or could you feel the moment?
Well, they say that if you see the moment, you've missed it. So I think that I was just shooting as much as I could. I was shooting on Hasselblad a lot of the time.
Right.
And I was shooting at wide open at the slowest speed that I felt I could get away with. So probably about a 15th of a second. So depending upon the lens, it would have been 2.8 at a 15th or f4 at 15th. And I didn't really know whether I was going to get anything. We just pushed the film as far as we could and hoped that we would get a printable negative. There was very little serious planning. I mean, I just shot. There's a limit to what you can do. I didn't want to use flash for two reasons. Firstly, because the band hated flash. They didn't want flashes going off in their faces. And secondly, because I didn't really know how to use flash in a creative sense back then. You were very restricted. The only flash gun I had with me was a Metz 504, which was a wet cell flash gun, quite bulky, with a bracket that fitted underneath the camera. It was a very direct, very harsh. It didn't have any of the aids that you have now to soften the light or spread the light, and there was obviously nothing to bounce the light off. And I don't think I understood how to do all of that. So I didn't use flash for those reasons. And I just shot available light. I moved around the stage. I went behind the band, shooting into the audience, into the spotlight, and just hoped that I would be able to capture something. I really had no idea whether I was going to get anything until we saw it, until we saw the film.
And how long would that be? A day later or a week later?
No, often it was weeks later, because I'm touring America. I'm not in a position to process on the road. So I would send the film in bulk every few days back to London, and they'd process it at my studio and send me a message basically saying, nothing's come out. or the legs are very thin, or whatever it is. I can't remember. I mean, I really don't recall. I just know that when I got back, there were hundreds of rolls of film that pretty much nobody had done anything with. I mean, there was no real call for the pictures. And it quite recently, Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed and produced the Stones at the time, he said to me that really the only reason he sent me on that tour was to make the band feel more important than they were.
How did you measure the light on stage?
I don't think I did. I mean, this is the point. I couldn't go up to Mick Jagger and point a light meter at him. And I was too far away in most cases to get any sense. I don't think I did. I think I just used what little instinct I had and made an exposure that I thought would give me a result. I mean, it wasn't very technical or it wasn't particularly calculated. It was just instinctive.
Yeah, some of these photos are great, many of them. What was your relationship with Mick Jagger, and did that change over the years?
Well, when we were working together, I mean, I started working with them in early 65, and I continued until about the middle of 67. And I got on very well with them. They made me feel like one of the band. I felt like I was, part of the gang. I felt very at ease. I felt very natural. They were very welcoming. They were very cooperative when I needed them to be. I don't remember any incidents of antagonism or anything of that nature. I would, I always think of those times as being very happy, very productive, very collaborative. And then they broke up with their manager during the recording of an album at Olympic Studios. And by that time, I'd established a very strong working relationship with Andrew Oldham, their manager, and was doing a lot of other work for him. And I was clearly on his side of the fence. And the Stones, particularly Mick and Keith, had formed a relationship, a friendship with a guy called Michael Cooper, who appears in the background of my last picture. And they brought him in, and I just knew my days were numbered, and that was that really. And I wasn't going to work with the Stones again, and Michael Cooper was, and I continued to have a friendship with Mick because I was friends with Marianne Faithfull, who he was with at the time. And so we went out to dinner a few times, and I went and photographed him at his house after that incident. And he was fine. He was always very friendly, but clearly I wasn't going to work with him as a band anymore.
You did turn up at the end of this book. I read that you did turn
1982.
Yes. And the clocks went back.
Yeah.
And then, suddenly something weird happened. Could you describe that story to us?
Well, it's a difficult story. It's a difficult story to describe because it was so weird. The Observer magazine asked me, who I worked with on a regular basis in the 70s and 80s, asked me if I was interested in photographing the Stones again, of course, and I said yes. And they said, we'd like you. They're rehearsing for their world tour, and we've got an exclusive, and we'd like to put you up as the photographer. I thought, fine, great. And they put me up, and the Stones apparently approved, and the message came back that they were looking forward to seeing me again. And then on the designated day, we were all ready to go. My car was packed. I had an assistant by that time, a guy called Toby, and he and I were sitting at the studio waiting for the phone call that would say where we were going, because it was a secret. The rehearsal venue was a secret. And I don't know when, but about midday, we got a call basically saying, Keith Richards in the shower and he's very excited to be seeing you again. Okay, fine, that's nice. Then half an hour later, I get a message, Mick's just got up, really looking forward to seeing you again. We'll let you know. And this went on through the day until about 7:30, 8 o'clock. And then we got a message saying, meet on a lay-by on the A30 or whatever it was. They wouldn't tell me where it was, they wouldn't tell me where the rehearsal was, just to meet on this lay-by. We met on the lay-by and we met Ian Stewart, who was the Stones roadie, who had been a friend of mine who I knew. And they were rehearsing at Shepperton Studios. They could have just told me Shepperton Studios, stage number 2, but they go through this whole ridiculous rigmarole. And so we follow Stu, we go into the studios, there's stage 2, and we go in and the whole stage is empty except for the band's lineup, which is as it would be on stage at that time in the 80s. And there were a load of people. I mean, there must have been 30 people, 40 people, technicians, family. Keith's father was there, Keith's son was there. Mick's girlfriend was there, the model, Jerry Hall, she was there. And there were very numerous people. And everybody was walking on eggshells. Everybody was very anxious. And I didn't really understand why. I just thought, well, I'd just walk in. And so I walked in, they weren't playing. I went up to them and they turned around, they saw me and they all embraced me like a long lost brother. And they gave me hugs. And there was a sigh of relief amongst all the hangers-on, because I suppose they were nervous that I was going to upset an apple cart of some sort. And the boys embraced me and we talked and we laughed and I told them about my assistant Toby and blah, blah, blah. And Mick said, you're not going to use flash, are you? Because we never use flash. And I said, no, I'm not going to use flash. I've got this fantastic fast film. I'm going to just shoot 35 millimeter, but I'd really like to do a posed portrait of the band for a cover of the magazine. They want a cover. And they said, yeah, okay, that's fine. Look around, find out where you want to do it. So I looked around. They had a sort of green room off the stage that had a very sort of funky wall and an old sofa. And I thought this would make a good place. So I went back and I said, I think in the green room. They said, fine, that's great. We'll do it towards the end of the evening. Okay. So then they started rehearsing and I started shooting and it all seemed to go really well. But they didn't do the posed shot for me. They didn't get to it. They put it off and they didn't get to it. But I got a lot of 35 millimeter stuff of them rehearsing and it was very exciting to be there and to be experiencing that feeling of being on stage with them. And the atmosphere seemed very good and various people came out of the shadows to introduce themselves. I'm the publicist, I'm this, I'm that, And it was nice. I'm enjoying it. And Toby was enjoying it. And we went home very early in the morning, feeling quite elated, but we hadn't got the cover. And I'd arranged to go back the next night to shoot the cover and a few other bits and pieces. And during that day, the next day, we got a call asking whether I'd considered going on the tour as the tour photographer. And I said, well, thank you very much. You know, I will think about it, but it's not the sort of thing that I'm do anymore. And I don't really think I want to commit myself to being away from home, and I've got a lot of work and blah, blah, blah. And then we went back to Shepperton. We got there at about 10:30, and the atmosphere was very different. There was no Mick. The word came through that Bill wasn't going to turn up. He had flu or a cold or wasn't going to be there. Charlie was a bit distant. Ronnie Wood, who I didn't really know, wasn't there. Keith hadn't turned up. So it was all a bit sort of messed up. And then Keith turned up and wouldn't really talk to me, and Ronnie came, and they were sort of their little gang of two, and they wouldn't talk to me. And the atmosphere was just completely different. And Mick then turned up at about 1:30 in the morning, and he was completely out of it, and he was very aggressive to me. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get my front cover. Apart from anything else, I don't have Bill here. So I'm not going to get my front cover. So I'll just step back and try and get a few more pictures of the band rehearsing, and then I'll slip away. But the atmosphere got very, very strange. And I finally plucked up the courage, because I wasn't getting anything. I wasn't getting any material, and the atmosphere was just really unpleasant. And finally, I sort of plucked up the courage, and I went up to them and I said, what's happened? You know, what's going on? And I can't remember whether it was Keith or Mick, but one of them turned around and he said that I just remind them of all the old times, all the bad old times, and that I'm bringing them down. And on that note, I slipped away.
Now, you said that Mick Jagger at the time was acting aggressive. How do you mean? Was he swearing at you? Was he telling you to go?
I don't remember. He was just aggressive and snarly and angry. You know, he was just aggressive and angry. I mean, he didn't accost me or threaten me. He just wasn't. You know, it went from bear hugs on one day and welcoming me like a long lost brother, to this sort of aggressive, total opposite. So it was a very, very strange, quite difficult to cope with. And when we drove back, my assistant was really quite upset, I think, about it, because he just couldn't understand it. You know, he just couldn't cope with the high and the low. And I said to him, well, it was just part of the story. It was just like a replay of my 3 years with the band back in the 60s. I mean, it was just, you know, started off all friendly and it ended crossly. And that was it, really. And I haven't really seen them since, except for a couple of social events where they were very friendly. So, you know, who knows?
And what happened to Michael Cooper and his photography with the Rolling Stones? Did that last long?
He died. He died in pretty horrible circumstances in North Africa in, I don't know when, the 70s, I think.
Well, what happened back then?
I don't know. They were doing lots of drugs. It was a very strange, difficult time. But I have no idea of his circumstances.
What was the relationship with Brian Jones at the time? Do you feel that he was the driving force of the band at some point, and then it kind of turned when?
I don't think he was the driving force of the. I don't think he was the driving force of the band in '65. I mean, he might have been in '63, but I don't think he was. In my first session with them, he was in good form. He was very friendly. He was a very, very crucial visual part of the whole band. I put him at the forefront of the picture that became the cover for Out of Our Heads. He looked spectacular. He was way ahead Mick and Keith at the time in terms of look. I mean, they caught up with him very quickly, but there was, he was very evolved as a sort of music star. Had that amazing hair and a great sort of dress sense, clothes sense. So he was in good form, but I mean, that changed. I mean, he was going downhill pretty steadily from that moment on, really. And when he was in good form, he was a really important, incredibly creative, musically intuitive and original contributor to the band, and made major contributions to whatever they were doing. But when he wasn't in good form, he was a pain. He was really difficult to be with and unpleasant to be with.
And how did Mick and Keith and the rest of the band cope with the success? People running after them for autographs, being recognized here and there.
Well, in the mid-60s, I think that they were up to a point still enjoying it. I think it was still part of the experience. It was a sort of a reminder, a continuous reminder of the success that they were having. And they were still ambitious, and they were still looking to consolidate their position as, if not the preeminent rock and roll band of the time, certainly the second most important band of the time. And so I think that they accepted the fans as part of the business, part of success. I'm not sure whether it's something that you enjoy all the time. It's a continuous demand, but overall they coped with it very well, and they were responsive. They might have mocked it behind closed doors, but when faced with the press or the fans, they were extremely nice and responsive and responsible.
You also recorded various sessions with the Rolling Stones, including one in 67 and others. What was that like? Were you capturing the creative moment as to when they were? Do you recall a song that they created or wrote when you were there?
Well, they were recording albums when I did several recording sessions, and they were recording Between the Buttons, and then I can't remember whether it's Satanic Majesties, I expect, but I can't really remember individual tracks particularly. And I was trying to capture part of the process, part of the atmosphere, and I was also just trying to build up a portfolio of really good portraits of the band, and to capture something about the process, the recording process. I mean, you couldn't really capture the magic, the creativity. That was something that was just almost impossible to. It was like magic. It was like fairy dust. You couldn't really understand what was happening. If you're not a musician, if you don't speak or think music, then seeing musicians like that in the recording studio, seeing the way a track emerges, is mysterious and magical and strange. And I couldn't capture that on film, but what I could try and do is to create nice, interesting portraits that reflected that moment, that period in the Stones' life.
When you were photographing them, did you ask them to pose or anything, or were you just there as a sort of fly on the wall, would you say?
Are you talking about recording studios?
Yes, recording studios. There's one here.
No, when in recording studios, I mean, it's a photojournalistic atmosphere. It's not. I'm not posing them. I mean, they're working. I mean, I'm not trying. I'm trying not to be intrusive. So, I guess you could call it a fly on the wall sort of experience. I'm certainly not posing them. That wouldn't be appropriate.
And I recall that you first met Marianne Faithfull a few years back, and you shot her at the Salisbury, central London.
I did. That was the sort of third or fourth session that I did with Marianne. I met Marianne in '64. It was through Marianne that Andrew Loog Oldham saw my work and asked me to work with the Stones.
How did you meet Marianne?
It was a social thing. She was going out with a friend of mine and we all met up for dinner. And I thought she was just absolutely captivating and beautiful. And I asked her if I could photograph her and took her out the next day.
Was she working as a model back then?
No, she was never a model.
Okay. She was a singer.
She was a singer. She was promoting As Tears Go By, her first single.
And that was written for her, right? By
Mick and Keith. Yeah.
Interesting. Can I call you back? Because I've got to. I'm running out of time on the Zoom. How long have you got?
Okay. Well, I'm running out as well. I've got quite a lot, which is why I was late to the call.
I see.
Because I've got quite a lot going on at the moment. So I'm a bit tied up. What was your plan? Did you want to just do another call straight away?
Let's do another call straight away, and then maybe we could reschedule another session. I've got to send you a link, if that's all right.
Yeah, but I probably only have 15 minutes now.
Yeah, that's all right. 15 minutes is fine.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Fantastic. Okay, you got 15 minutes. Let's zoom into the future and into the past. You had a studio in Mayfair. How did that come about? Was there a bit of sponsorship? Was there a bank loan or something like that? Because Mayfair, and was it expensive, or did you manage to generate pretty good profit?
It wasn't like that. Mayfair might have been expensive, but we found a building in Mason's Yard. It wasn't very expensive. We needed some help with the deposit, which my dad came up with. And we set up the studio there in '63. And the reason we had to find a studio was because I was working for a wonderful man called Jeff Fields, whose studio was in Hanover Square. And he had to leave that premises soon after I started working for him because the building was going to be redeveloped. And so we needed to find a place, and with my dad's help, we found Mason's Yard. And then Jeff, his business really took off, and within 6-7 months, he'd moved on. He moved on to another premises in Soho, and I stayed at Mason's Yard until the end of '69.
Yeah, and you shot quite a lot in there, including portraits of Jimi Hendrix. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Did you ever meet his entourage, or would he come to your studio alone?
Well, he didn't have an entourage. I photographed him with his band. If that's what you mean. With Mitch and Noel, who were the Experience. But there was no entourage. I mean, their roadie dropped them off at the studio at about 11:30, 12 o'clock, and that was it. And it was just me and the three of them. And that was it, really. We just spent the rest of the day shooting and eating and talking. And then the roadie would turn up again at about 5 o'clock and drive them off to their gig, wherever that was.
Would you go to the gig as well?
No.
Do you feel that at the time was there a certain energy that the musicians were captivating, or that do certain people have different energies? Did you feel that?
I mean, I think there was the energy of youth and the energy of the 60s, which was an energy that seemed to be about being able to do whatever you wanted. An energy that said you could try things out, you could experiment, you could explore, you could that you had an opportunity to do it your way, or certainly not to do it the old way. You could break the rules and break out of the restrictions that were keeping people back earlier on in the decade. So I think that was an energy, but I don't really, I don't think that when a musician came to the studio, they didn't have a particular, what did they? I don't know. I haven't really thought it through. I mean, I'm sure Jimmy had charisma, and he certainly looked wonderful, but I don't think there was a sort of, I think that the younger people in the 60s just had a desire to be successful and to punch out, to reach out, and to try and find a different way of doing things. Certainly that was my motivation. I mean, I was just trying to find a different way to present musicians in photographs. I was trying to get record covers. I was trying to get poster images. I was trying to just create images for musicians in a way that, as far as I was concerned, they hadn't really been done before.
And you created a fantastic series as well, moving into the 70s, of Kate Bush. How did that happen? And what was her reaction to you as a photographer? Do you think there was a good chemistry? Was she willing to take direction, or would you experiment?
Well, I mean, the reason the Kate Bush pictures came about was because EMI, who were a regular client of mine, they didn't have a portrait to launch her with. They had a record cover for the first album, which was called A Kick Inside, or The Side, I think. But it wasn't a particularly strong portrait of Kate. It was a rather cumbersome sort of conceptual image. And nobody really liked it at the record company, but they felt they had to use it, and they needed portraits to launch her with. And I'd already, by this time, so we're talking about 1978, I had a reputation of creating strong images of musicians that would lend themselves to exploiting in the media and promoting people, and just something I seem to be good at, and people like that. And so I was brought in quite specifically to come up with images of Kate to launch her, and that's what I did. And she was wonderful. She was absolutely marvelous. She was incredibly beautiful, very, very energetic, very frenetic, full of ideas, very creative. She was wonderful and exhausting to work with. And I did about 4 or 5 sessions of her through 78 into 79. Virtually all the official pictures that we used in that first year were mine.
Right. You say, and you also worked with Chin Chapman. How did that come about?
Chin and Chapman, well, I think the first artist I photographed for them was Susie Quattro. And they were a couple of guys. So I don't know. I don't really know where to start with Chin and Chapman. I mean, they were very prolific hit makers, songwriters, and producers. And they really liked what I did. And as I said to you earlier in this conversation, there was a real loyalty amongst people. And they were very prolific. and they asked me to work with all their artists. I mean, I was just their photographer from, I guess, about 72. I have no idea when it sort of ended. Early 80s, I suppose.
Yes. Did you ever meet someone called Holly Penfield at the time?
No.
Or Debbie Harry?
No.
You worked with Randy Newman. What was he like to work with?
Very diffident, very quiet, not somebody who enjoyed having his picture taken, which is why if you look at the picture, you'll see it says "Do not disturb" on the door.
Right. Yeah, which is right.
So, I mean, I put him in a sort of, I squeezed him into a sort of closet. You know, that was an editorial portrait. It wasn't for Randy Newman. I was really pleased. I liked him, liked his work, and I was pleased to do it. But it was a editorial portrait is something that I did a lot of in the 70s and 80s, but it was always a bit compromised. You know, you'd have to go. In this case, I think it was the Hilton Hotel on Park Lane. You know, and you get. I think I used to get at least 15 or 20 minutes, during which time you have to try and make a portrait. And the subject is doing that several times that day and is usually pretty pissed off about it. And so I always try to make it as enjoyable for them as possible. And at the same time, try and say something of the portrait that was relevant or amusing or made it graphically more interesting. And I think the Randy Newman portrait is a good example of that.
And you also worked with Oasis. Were they difficult to work with, or?
Yes, they were terrible to work with.
Why is that? Do you think they were on drugs or something?
They didn't want to have their picture taken. I mean, I don't think it was anything to do with me. It was just that they didn't want to do the session, and they were it was very early on. I think it's 94 or 95. And they're very early on. They were going to Europe. They were going somewhere like Sweden or Norway. And they came to my studio because I was shooting a cover for Mojo magazine. That was considered to be important, that they needed to do that. And at that moment in time, I thought that they were a Beatles or a Stones tribute band. I didn't really rate them particularly. And the publicity that existed about the brothers feuding and everything, I just thought was tiresome. And I was going to do a pastiche of my Rolling Stones Between the Buttons picture on Primrose Hill, sold to the magazine as being an interesting concept, and they liked it. But when the boys arrived, Liam and Noel had some sort of ghastly feud, and Noel wasn't talking. I mean, he just simply wasn't talking. I've never had anybody give me such an aggressive look as Noel did when he stormed into the studio, and he just threw himself onto a sofa and sort of rolled over and made out that he was going to sleep. And in the meantime, Liam set himself up in the kitchen of the studio and sort of just started kicking everything, kicking the furniture and kicking the walls. And I was just in the studio with the representative from the record company and my assistant. And I basically was thinking, well, I'm going to give them an hour. And if they can't pull themselves together, then, we're not going to get this. Unfortunately, their tour manager was somebody I knew and knew quite well. And he knew me and he knew my work. And I went up to him and I said, can you do anything about this? Because otherwise I'm going to pull the plug. There's no point. It's unpleasant, it's uncreative, unproductive, just a waste of my time. And he said, no, I'll try and have the words with them. And he sort of managed to grab them together, and he took them into a corner, and he basically said to them, look, this is really important. You get the cover of Mojo magazine. Gered Mankowitz is a photographer who really knows what he's doing. You should really, you should do this. And one of them shouted out something about it's only a fucking photograph and why should they? And the whole atmosphere was really horrible, but he managed to persuade them to give it a go. And the moment we started working, and they saw the Polaroids, and they sort of liked what we were doing, and actually we ended up getting a rather good session, and it was a good cover. Mojo were very happy, but I never, I've never come across them since, and I have no idea whether they have any recollection of the session or not. I hardly think they would, but so that was the Oasis experience. It was actually rather unpleasant.
You took some great shots of David, Stuart, and Annie Lennox here.
Yeah. Well, that was my last session with Eurythmics. So I got to know Dave and Annie when they were in a band called The Tourists. And I did a cover for The Tourists called The Reality Effect. And I did 1 or 2 sessions with them for press and promotion. And I loved The Tourists. I thought they were a great band. And I adored Annie. Thought, she was just absolutely magnificent to photograph. And when they left The Tourists and formed Eurythmics, they couldn't get a recording contract. And so I and a couple of other photographers who they knew contributed photographs for their first few singles, on the understanding that if RCA, the record company, picked up on the single, then we would get paid. If they didn't, then we wouldn't. So we were sort of trying to help, and we were having fun, and we were taking some really interesting pictures. Unfortunately, RCA did pick up, and the band were a huge success. And I did several sessions with them. And then that particular picture that you just shown, that was the last session which we did in Paris. And I thought it was going to be the cover of a magazine, and I did several setups, but I thought that was a really beautiful photograph. I beg your pardon, I said a cover of a magazine, I meant a cover of the album. And I really loved the simplicity of that portrait. I just thought that the balance between Dave and Annie, the way Annie looked, and the simplicity of it was incredibly powerful. And that all the focus was on them, which is absolutely imperative in my portraiture. Mm-hmm. And then when we finished and I was talking to Dave, he said that he was going to have a painting made of my portrait, and he was going to put that on the cover. And I was very, very disappointed, quite upset about that. And that's what he did. And I've never understood what his thinking was, because my portrait's vastly superior to the painting. And that was that. I don't think I think I've definitely had a dialogue with them since, because I've remained in touch with Annie and Dave, but I never photographed them.
Are you in contact with other photographers, rock photographers? Do you guys sort of hang around together, like Annie Leibovitz, or maybe there's another British photographer who worked for NME at the time, or do sort of photographers stick to themselves, or is it?
Well, I always stuck to myself at the time. I didn't care to hang out with other photographers. I felt intimidated and inhibited by other photographers. So I didn't really mix very much with other photographers, other than the photographers that I shared my studios with. But subsequently, I've got to know a lot of my contemporaries and get on very well with most of them. And I made a television series called Icon Music Through the Lens, which was a 6-part history of music photography. And I was executive producer on that. And it was my original idea. And that was shown on Sky last year on PBS in America. And through that, I met an awful lot of photographers who I got on well with, and it was very enjoyable and interesting meeting them and interviewing them and getting to know them a bit better. But at the time, I didn't really mix with other photographers at all.
I understand that you were not so keen on touring with musicians and bands. So were you afraid of flying, or was it the schedule too intense?
I had enough. No, I love flying actually. I had enough of touring after the Stones tour because it was so unproductive. I mean, it just felt, it wasn't creative, particularly photographically. You were continuously compromised by the lighting. You've got to understand that this was before tours became so elaborate and so technically advanced. This was when bands toured without anything. They didn't have lights, they didn't have a sound crew, they didn't have a sound check even. It was, it was very crude. And I just thought that I enjoyed my America experience in many, many ways. And I'm very, very pleased that I did it, but I didn't want to repeat it. I mean, with the Stones or with anybody else, it wasn't the sort of photography that I wanted to do. I didn't feel that it was productive or creative or that it had any purpose. And by the time in the 80s, when touring with a band was a big business for a lot of photographers, I was into other things. And I, apart from that very brief moment in 1982, when the Stones dangled the possibility of me going on tour with them, right. It never even came up. And I'd made it very clear from 65 that I wasn't going to do that. I mean, that just wasn't something I wanted to do. And I don't want to be away, didn't want to be away from my home, my family. I just didn't want to do it. It's never appealed to me, really. And the only times I've done it subsequently have been for very specific jobs. So I went to Germany for 2 or 3 days with Gary Moore to shoot a live album cover. Earlier I went and did a live session with Slade for a live album cover. But these were specific assignments. They weren't going on tour. They were just, 2 or 3 days here or there. And they were fun. I enjoyed that because I had a specific purpose and it, it wasn't long enough to become tiresome.
Did you ever have any contact with Madonna or Bob Dylan or Frank Sinatra?
No, none of them. I photographed Bing Crosby.
Okay,
that's about as close. That's about as close to that sort of. It's close to Frank as I'll ever get.
Did they? They had their own photographers that they're all.
Well, I don't know. You see, I was never an editorial photographer, so I never got an assignment from the NME or the Melody Maker or whatever it was, to go off and photograph Bob Dylan at the Royal Albert Hall or Madonna or whatever. That wasn't my business. So my business was that people came to me at my studio and I created portraits, usually for album covers, but for other purposes, images that would hopefully help those artists become successful. And most of the artists that I was photographing it was early in their career.
Right.
So, you know, I don't think that Madonna's management or anybody else, I don't think I would have been on their horizon, really. So it just never came up. I mean, it never.
Yeah.
Madonna's early days were in New York. She was doing, you know, she was doing her early session with people like Deborah Feingold in New York, you know, and I wasn't there. Maybe if she'd been doing them like Kate Bush in London, then maybe I would have been a photographer. So it never came up. So actually, you know, there are a lot of artists that I haven't worked with because they just never got round to seeking me out.
Yeah, yeah. And what kind of advice would you give to photographers these days? Do you think there's too many, or is it not innovative enough, or is it extremely innovative, you know, in terms of image? And
I don't know. I mean, I think that all photographers, any young photographer, has just got to keep at it and take photographs. And I mean, what I always say to aspiring music photographers is that they need to establish relationships and friendships with local venues and local bands, and you know, embed themselves with these and build up relationships so that they get good pictures, and you know, maybe those bands will go on to be successful, and their pictures of them will also be successful. I have no idea what it's like out there. You know, I've kept out of the commercial arena for so long. I really don't know, and I don't know what I would say to somebody as to how to get work. I mean, I just have no idea. It's not something that I have anything to do with.
When you're creating album covers, do you discuss the concept with the artists or the record label?
Well, that varies. I mean, we're going back again. So that varies. I mean, when record companies have art directors, then usually the art director of the record company, in conjunction with the artist or the artist management, comes up with some ideas for a cover, probably based on listening to a few tracks and knowing something about the subject. And then they will go and they will choose a photographer who they think is the most appropriate to that particular job. The other way is that if you're close to the management, close even to the artist, then you and they might originate the cover idea and present it to the record company and the art department. So it's a process that varies. It's sort of organic. And but again, I don't know how it happens now. I mean, you know, all I know is that on the very few projects that I still work on, which tend to be projects with old friends who I've remained in contact with, who have a re-release of an album or a new album, and they want me to do a cover for them. It's a process of me working with them, listening to the music, working with them, getting a sense of what they want. It's what I've always done. And shooting something and sending it to the record cover company and hoping that they like it.
Are there times when you're making album covers or working with musicians where you don't particularly like the music? Does that affect the photography?
It's never been a prerequisite to like the music. It's important to understand what the artist is expressing and who they're trying to communicate with. But it's not really important to actually like the music, particularly yourself. You're more objective than that. I think. It certainly hasn't got in my way. I've always been able to hear something that I can relate to that helps me get into the mind of the artist and get an understanding of what they're trying to express and say.
Fantastic. And you've taken some really good shots of Led Zeppelin here on stage. What do you think Robert Plant has something that most people don't have in terms of stage presence? Was he...
Oh, I don't know. Those pictures were taken in 1969 at something called the Session, which was a TV show, an ill-conceived television show. And I'd known Jimmy Page for quite a while. I'd known him from about 1965. I'd photographed him in 1966 when he was with the Yardbirds. So I knew him and we were quite friendly. But I never really met Robert. Certainly at that point in time, Led Zeppelin were fantastic. I didn't particularly care for their music, but capturing something of them in their performance was exciting, and I was very pleased to do it.
And what was perhaps your most favorite moment of working with musicians? Are there any artists that you can recall working with, or images that really stay with you and you think stay with the public and audience?
Well, I think I'm fortunate. I think there's a lot, actually. I think I've done a lot of pictures that have stayed with people and remain iconic. You know, I think the pictures that I did with Kate Bush and Eurythmics and Suzi Quatro and the Stones and Hendrix and Marianne, and I think there are a lot. And it's difficult to try and pull one artist out of that. I would probably say Jimi Hendrix, because the pictures of Jimmy have a life of their own now. And that's a very rare thing, you know, because of everything that happened with him. In the short period after taking those pictures, the pictures have a value and a meaning, a relevance and an importance that you could never ever plan for. And so, you know, they are incredibly, I'm very lucky to have had that chance to take them. And I suppose because of that, they particularly stand out.
Did you ask him to sort of address the way he did, or did he come up with all the ideas himself at the time?
Sorry, you froze, Richard.
Sorry,
I didn't hear that question.
It's probably the connection. Did you ask him to dress in a certain manner or look in a certain way? How would you prompt the artist in the studio? How would
you asking about Jimmy?
Yes, about Jimi Hendrix.
Well, I mean, the thing about Jimmy is that was how he looked. He dress up. Those clothes were the clothes that he was wearing, clothes that he brought with him. It's not, you know, that was one of the most extraordinary things about him, was just took to the fashion of the day like a duck to water. Everything about that moment in street fashion was appropriate to him. It was as though it was designed for him. As far as posing, you've got to understand that he's in my studio and he's standing in my background and I'm lighting him. You know, it's not an accident. It's not a fluke. It's something that you work with somebody. And when you're working with a musician, you can't really manipulate them. You have to nurture them and encourage them to communicate something with the camera. And with a combination of trust and confidence, you you are able, if you're lucky, to get that moment of contact. And with Jimmy, I was very lucky because for whatever reason, he gave me that extraordinary magical contact that makes a portrait extra special.
Absolutely. That's absolutely fantastic. Gered, let's keep in contact.
Okay, Richard.
Mankowitz, one of the world's great music and rock photographers. What are your future plans? Lastly, what's happening now? And
well, my future plans are to continue working with the archive. I've handed the management of the archive over to another company, and I'll continue to work as a consultant, and hopefully, this new company will take the work to a new level, and over the coming years, we'll embrace new technology and make fantastic things happen. I don't know. I'm just going to carry on.
It's possible we'll see Jimi Hendrix in a virtual world at some point.
Yes, in a virtual studio. We'll recreate my studio in Mason's Yard, and you can come along and watch Jimmy in my studio. Who knows? If ABBA can do it, we can do it.
Absolutely. Just a couple of things. Are you allowed to mention the company that you licensed the pictures to, or the
AIG? Well, no, not AIG. What am I saying? Iconic Images.
Okay.
Iconic Images, they're part of ABG, Allied Brand, Authentic Brands Group.
You must have millions of images. Is that correct?
No, not millions, but tens of thousands.
Okay, and so do you give them the photos, the negs?
How it works is really between me and them. It's not something I want to talk about.
Okay, indeed. Well, thanks very much. And will you be having an exhibition soon?
There's nothing planned, but we're working over the next couple of years. We'll be working on hopefully a big retrospective book and a big exhibition. There's lots of plans in the pipeline. I've really only just done this deal, and it's all new. It's all exciting and all to play for.
That sounds great. Let's keep in contact, especially when it comes to, creative endeavors and exhibitions and stuff like that. And I look forward to seeing your series shortly.
Yeah, it's on Sky. If you've got Sky, you'll be able to stream it.
Yes. Brilliant. Thank you, Gered. Thanks for your time.
Richard. Thanks, Richard.
All the best. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch. This podcast is kindly supported by Camera Museum of London, pre-owned Hasselblad specialists located at 44 Museum Street, London, WC1A 1LY. Visit the website on www.cameramuseum.uk.